Hi, and welcome back to another edition of Microservices TV. We have Kyle Brown back with us today, extending his streak as the most welcome guest that we have, almost becoming a series regular now. So we're extending and just kind of evolving the conversation we've been having so far of breaking things down for microservices, both from an application standpoint and data. And so when talking with clients, talking with customers, and just users in general, they're bought in microservices, they want to get started. Now, what are some of those next steps that we figure out is, okay, is it big bang, boom, I'm done microservices, or what are some of those pieces that we can figure out?
Right, and in fact, it rarely happens that anyone can ever do a big bang, I'm done, microservices. It doesn't work out that way. I mean, just in enterprises of the type that you and I work with, it's always a brownfield. You're always going to have something there to start with, be it data or be it code that you're going to have to begin with. So the other thing that I really wanted to kind of talk about is not just kind of what this evolution looks like, but also, how do you learn all the new tools and all the new techniques that you're going to have to adopt to really be successful at this. And so the way that we've really gone about this is you and I have talked through this notion of how there's kind of different levels of microservices, and you can just call them by different names as you kind of work your way into a full microservices architecture.
Okay.
Yeah. So the first one is this great thing that came from a slide that you had developed as you were talking with some of the customers that had done that about this idea of macroservices.
Yep, the larger, more coarse grain services.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, that's what SOA services are, is they're macro services, because they're not really built with the whole set of microservices tenants in mind. But there are still some good things that you can try to do to go along the path, even with your macro services. I mean, the first one would be if you're not on top of a RESTful interface. Let's say you're on top of SOAP. Well, that's a refactoring you want to do right there. You want to move from a functional-based interface to more of a entity-based interface with REST. But the other thing that you really want to think about doing with that is this is where you can begin to get consumption of those macro services by, let's say, registering them with something like IBM API Management and Bluemix. And with API Management, what that will allow you to do is, you just take a single Swagger doc that describes that service that represents your business value and your business object that you're looking at, and then you publish that Swagger doc and it becomes a Bluemix tile that you can then use for your Bluemix clients, your mobile apps and all the rest of those things are going to be calling that. So that's really the first of the levels of what you would look at.
That makes sense, and I mean I'm sure you can look at any project and see a large kind of number of those that would be low-hanging fruit, good targets, and then be able to see some of that iterative value early on and be able to kind of capture some of that, like you said, initial business value and kind of see the legitimate value in the technology and not just for technology's sake.
Yep.
Okay, so that's the kind of the big coarse grain one. What's the next step as far as moving on into some of that?
Remember in some of the earlier talks that you and I have had in this series, we've talked about this notion of beginning to functionally split up your services. That's really the next step. And if you wanted to, I guess we could, if we're calling the first step macro services, we call these mini services. Because you're really not changing the interfaces so much as you're really thinking about this whole repackaging opportunity of being able to split it up. And that's where you can really now start to use some of the opportunities you have for things like splitting them up into individual Liberty runtimes, as opposed to maybe putting all of them together in one big air file across your whole WebSphere ND cell.
Exactly, just making it tight, making it as kind of condensed as possible for as focused in whichever artifact or delivery vehicle you have for just that one component.
Right, so your choices there is, if we are going to start splitting them up, I could put it either on WebSphere Liberty on Cloud Foundry Instant Runtime, or I could put it in WebSphere Liberty in a container on Bluemix. Either of those would work fine. Now, the other thing is that now you can start to, again, slowly work your way into this notion of having independent management and independent operations of these services as well. So this is where you would want to add things like a monitoring service. Either the monitoring and analytics service in Bluemix or something like New Relic would be a great thing to be able to do as you're learning about how to operate things as a suite of services as opposed to just one big monolithic application.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so, I mean, that's where this really goes to show that we're just layering in additional pieces as we grow, where it's, starting with those bigger low-hanging fruit projects, define success, achieve success, layer in additional components, update your goals, and kind of keep going until eventually you're getting things, like you said, getting a little bit smaller, getting it packaged right, and then you can start layering some more components. So if we're at mini services, I mean, we're not hosting mini services TV, we're talking microservices TV. So I imagine our next step would be getting closer to microservices and layering in some of that.
Right, and by the time we've got to the code refactor and we've got the packaging, really what we're now to the part of adopting are the DevOps practices that really make microservices so valuable. So it's now the time that you're going to start really applying individual continuous integration, continuous delivery pipelines for each of those services. And for that, again, you can use something like the delivery pipeline in Bluemix as an excellent opportunity to be able to say, for each of these individual Liberty services that I'm creating, I can have an independent delivery pipeline for that. And then you can also make the decision about, well, okay, now is the time to do independent scaling of each of them. And I can add the auto scaling service if I'm on Cloud Foundry, or if I was in containers, I could just use container groups and I could scale those independently. So now by the time you've sort of stepped your way through it, you are to all the tenets of a basic microservices architecture.
And then in that same, if you followed this path, I mean, one application that you started with before, prior to the macro service or in your monolith, once you've got to this point, you could have one pipeline that is doing something in Cloud Foundry on Bluemix and another pipeline that's doing something in containers on Bluemix, but that's all a part of the same application, contributing microservice components to that.
Totally, absolutely, because now that you're finally to that point to where everyone's going through the same interface, be it REST or be it MQLite, and that everyone's on an independent pipeline and everyone's on the independent runtimes, now you can actually start to vary things. You can make those choices like, well, for this particular service, I never liked my Java implementation. Let's throw it away and replace it with Node, or let's throw it away and replace it with something else. And you could also vary your persistence choices. If everything was originally on DB2 or on Oracle, you can now start to say, well, this particular microservice makes more sense to be on a NoSQL database like Cloudant or any of the other choices you have. So, and the last one is that now that we've finally gotten to a microservices architecture, now we're ready to really take advantage of it. So now you can actually start to look at microservices at the scale of what we all want to get microservices to.
One of the key tenets of going to microservices is that scalability component.
Exactly. And when you start thinking about that, there's this kind of gap that I know I've seen in the projects I've worked on. And the gap is that microservices as an architecture is great for a lot of applications, but not every microservices application is ever going to need huge scale.
Yeah, exactly.
The average of most of what I've seen in most applications on total number of microservices is under 10. They're not that big, but there are those that are. And for those, you're going to have to think about some of the harder issues like service discovery. I know that you and Dan Berg talked about the service discovery service in Bluemix, and that's where you would really want to use that, is when the numbers start to get beyond what you can just directly code into your system. You need to start thinking about that, and especially some of the proxying and some of the rules-based configuration that it allows. And then the last one is, when you're getting to that scale and you're starting to manage each of these things independently, that's where you're going to have to start thinking about some of the more complex options like active deploy, as you're starting to look at ways that you can roll these services out and kind of do the ramp up and ramp down that you can get with active deploy, so that you can move new versions into production without upsetting any of the clients that you had on the old versions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, a lot of that ends up being the notion where you want to get to the microservices so you can figure out and kind of start achieving some of the mini scale versions, so that you have enough to maintain some of your high availability style, so you're not single container, single instance, things like that. But you don't necessarily have to go from 1 to 1,000. You're 1 to 3, 1 to 5, like you said, at most sometimes 10. Sometimes you have a very kind of temporal traffic that you're able to keep track of, so you're going to scale up in a certain time, scale down. But then once you do have more wild kind of patterns in your traffic data, you can end up, like you said, layering some of those additional pieces for dynamic service registration, and then also being able to, now as all of your components are wildly distributed, you have different teams pushing at different times. That's where something like active deploy would come into play and really help you to understand that I can, have multi versions of applications running. So, I mean, that really does make a big difference when you're looking at the monolith and everybody deploying the monolith and staying up on a Friday night after most of your user base has gone to sleep, and then, the big switch over and something breaks and it's holding you back, as opposed to just, moving forward very fast and being able to do all this independently during the day job and, keep pushing more, keep pushing smaller, and then not having to worry about it.
Yep. You're really into a stage of optimization. By the time you get to that level of scale, you're trying to just really optimize your procedures so that you're not going to get disruption. And that's where also, if you wanted to fold in something like Netflix Hystrix, that would be the time to do that. Once you've kind of got your architecture in place, you can stand up Netflix Hystrix, let's say inside of a Bluemix container, and then you can, write your clients to be able to use that so that you have that option of being able to say that, look, if I do have back-end failures, I can deal with those more resiliently and not have to have it, bring my entire system come crashing down around.
Makes a lot of sense. So just recapping, we're starting with our monoliths, then we're looking at breaking this down into coarse-grained macro services. Next step, going into mini services to kind of layer in some of the where we want to get to right-size packaging. Then taking the step into true microservices and being able to deliver those in a CI/CD pipeline independently of each other. And then finally looking to go at scale and do some of the more dynamic registry, dynamic deployment, and auto-scaling type pieces.
And not every team is going to get all the way through those.
Yep.
Not every team is going to need to get all the way through those. It's just that they're always available for the teams that need it, for the problems that need it. You can't assume that one size fits all. You just got to kind of work your way through it and figure out exactly where your problem needs to stop.
More of a model and less of a process as far as being able to move forward through it. So those are definitely some great points. So. That wraps up another episode of Microservices TV for Kyle Brown and myself. We'll look to have Kyle back on very soon once we have some more of these services out, and we can talk about whatever else is happening in the world of microservices in the next time, which I'm sure will be some great advances at that point. But once again, for Kyle Brown, this is Rick Kosowski signing off for Microservices TV. Have a good one.